Good morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and as always told out of Voice of Radio. So today, we need to take a little bit of a look at Dark Explorers. Yeah, that's right. Dark Explorers, that's how far we've gotten in our complete look at the complete history of the Pokemon trading card game. And we've looked in the past couple of weeks at Noble Victories and Next Destinies. And I told you that both of those sets, both of those expansions, were over the top nuts good and changed the game. Well, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, it happened again. Dark Explorers was flat out amazing. Now, it was released in Japan on the 16th of December 2011. You would never see a release date like that in the US, Europe, etc. But that's a bit weird, because it's way too close to Christmas. And it was released in English on the 9th of May 2012, just in time to transform Nationals and Worlds 2012, and transform it did. Now, there weren't that many cool new facts about this particular set, but one of them is that for the first time they brought in secret rare trainer cards. We had a gold secret rare Pokemon Catcher. We hadn't seen those before. It instantly became a very sought after, very popular card, which is very, very cool. Also, I might as well mention it here, one of the packs had Excadrill on. Actually, while we're here, there were 2 Excadrill in the set, and neither of them were particularly good, which makes me very sad indeed. But I like the love for Excadrill. Wasn't actually what I was trying to talk about, but I just remembered that, and it made me very happy. Now, the pre-release promo was Volcarona, and this was a bit weird, because Volcarona wasn't just a stamped version of a card in the set proper, like we'd gotten accustomed to with our pre-release promos. It was actually an alternate art promo, which was given its own Black Star promo numbering. It was a proper promo, it had the Black Star, it had a promo number, it had alternate artwork, and that was very, very different. Even just going back one set to Next Destinies, saw that our pre-release promo was just Arcanine, and it was a regular Arcanine, well, a regular Arcanine from the set, but stamped with the logo for Next Destinies. Things changed, and I thought that was pretty gosh darned cool. It just made the pre-release promos a little bit cooler. Here is a look at the pre-release promo box as well. Remember, you still got these at the time, and remember they were, well, I think flimsy is the best way to describe them. They looked cool, they were cool, but anyone who used these a lot like I did, this was back before I had children and a mortgage and a wife, and let's just say I did not attend one pre-release, I attended multiple. So I'd use the pre-release boxes, and they would fall apart rather quickly indeed. Never mind. Now, what was really cool here, and excellent for collectors, and I assume if they're not really sought after now, they will be soon, we had Eevee promos, but they were a little bit weird. So, when you attended a city championships, you got yourself an Eevee. Now, I personally hope that this Eevee is never really worth anything, because I went to so many city championships at the time that I literally just had these, like, on the floor of my car, because I would go to a city championships and drive home and it would fall off the seat of my car, and that's a little bit sad. Turns out they're worth like 15 quid, so that's a little bit sad. There was at least 3 or 4 of these that got properly wrecked in my car. But it got cooler from there. Now, if you went to a winter regional, you would get yourself a Flareon. These were reprints from the set, but they had the cross-hatched holo and the symbol for the particular tournament. If you went to a spring regional in the EU, you would get yourself a Vaporeon, but that same Vaporeon was given out at state championships in the US. Umbreon became another spring regional promo. In the US, it was the only spring regional promo. In the EU, you would have Vaporeon for some and Umbreon for others. If you went to autumn regionals, you would get yourself a Jolteon. And at Nationals, you would get yourself an Espeon. So the Gen 1 and 2 Eevees were given out as tournament promos in that way. Clearly, Espeon, being as popular as it is and being the national promo, very, very few people went to more than one Nationals. That one is actually quite an expensive card. The staff version of the Espeon promo will set you back about over £100. It's a pretty valuable card nowadays. Not the most in the set. We'll get there in a moment. So they were very, very cool. In terms of EXs, we did get a bunch of new EXs in the set, and like we'd seen, they all got a full art version as well. So we had Entei, which was a cool card that won Canadian Nationals. We'll get there in a moment. Kyogre, which fit into those Klinklang decks. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Raikou, that fit very much into those Eels decks. Again, we'll get there in a moment. Groudon, which was a very cool card that saw play in a bunch of different decks with Darkrai and Klinklang and all of that. Darkrai, which... Now again, last week I told you about Mewtwo, and I told you how ridiculously over-the-top Mewtwo was. In this era, it was Mewtwo and Darkrai. They were, by a huge margin, the two best cards in the game, and it's really hard to pick between them. Mewtwo had the bigger impact on the format when it came out, but Darkrai actually saw more success and won worlds more, so I'm going to let you argue amongst yourselves on that one. They were both phenomenal cards. And then Tornadus, which saw play in those Celebi Prime decks that were again very good, and Tornadus EX, it was absolutely integral to the deck that I used to grind into the World Championships in 2012. This was very much my era. Seriously, 2011, 2012, and I know it's a decade ago now, alright? But they were the 2 years where I saw, top-cutting Nationals, top-cutting the biggest tournaments in Europe, grinding into the World Championships. They were the years where I had big finishes. I've had plenty of top cuts since, but shall we say they were the 2 years. So a lot of these cards, like Tornadus, have particular significance to me. Now, we did have some new secret rares in the set as well. We had Gardevoir and Archeops, as well as the aforementioned Pokemon Catcher. Remember, these were just reprints of cards we'd previously seen. The Archeops is the one that stops your opponent playing evolved Pokemon and ended up being banned, and the Gardevoir is the one that doubled your energy and people tried to play with Mewtwo, but it wasn't actually ever good enough. And then Pokemon Catcher, which was basically a 4 of in every deck, and was huge. They were all very valuable cards. Speaking of which, the most valuable card in the set was, well, nowadays, as I'm recording this, is Gardevoir. It seems like you'll be paying $400 for a mint version if you're lucky. That is a very valuable card. And it's largely because Gardevoir is hyper popular, and these secret rare cards really were secret and rare, hard to get hold of, and we weren't in the trying to get everything graded, hoarding all the secret rare cards era that we are nowadays. So these kind of secret rares from a decade ago will end up being a lot more valuable than equivalent cards from now, where product is selling in larger numbers and everyone's getting everything graded. Yeah, it's a pretty cool card. This is apparently one of the ones I don't have, so that makes me sad. We did have a couple of theme decks, as we always do. They were Shadows and Raiders. Shadows was your Zoroark theme deck, which was based around water and darkness Pokemon. You got yourself a holo and a non-holo Zoroark. Holo was exclusive, it was a non-holo in the set. And then you got yourself non-holo rares of Glaceon, Swanna, and Empoleon. We'll get to Empoleon. Empoleon was nuts. It was also exclusive, it was a holo in the set proper. This was the only place to get the non-holo. Raiders was based around Cofagrigus, and it was a Psychic Darkness deck. And you got yourself a holo and a non-holo Cofagrigus. The holo being exclusive to the deck, it was a non-holo in the set. And then you got yourself non-holo rares of Scrafty, Espeon, and Crocodile. Crocodile being exclusive, it was a holo in the set. The non-holo could only be got in the theme deck. What was cool was, even though it was one Zoroark, one Cofagrigus deck, they both came with Zoroark coins, which I kind of appreciate. Now, in terms of the best cards, this was a very good set with some very good cards, but let's not bury the lead. Darkrai EX was just ridiculous. Like, proper job, over the top ridiculous. Game-defining ridiculous. Now, I've made a lot of mistakes through the podcast and in my YouTube videos talking about Pokemon cards. But probably the biggest mistake, the dumbest thing I ever actually said, was when I first saw this Darkrai card. And there's a podcast, it's out there, you can go and listen to it, where I said that Darkrai had a good ability, but wasn't a particularly good card. It would be a tech, because the ability gave your Pokemon with Darkness Energy free retreat. And then it went on to be one of the very best cards we have ever seen in the history of the game. You see, the ability giving free retreat was good, but for free energy you had Night Spear, 90 to the active, 30 to one of your opponent's bench. But the thing is, back then the EXs generally had 180 HP, so Night Spear would get a 2-hit KO, or the residual damage 3 times, plus an attack in the active would get the KO. There were Pokemon around like Sableye that had 60 HP, so hitting them twice on the bench would get a KO. And you had all those support Pokemon around like Smeargle and Shaman and things of that nature that all had less than 90 HP. The point is, what made this card so good, and the thing that I missed when I first looked at and analysed this card, because we are very much in the era here where I was producing content for the game, the numbers. The secret to Darkrai was the numbers. 90 got a 1-hit KO on the support Pokemon while 2-hit KOing the attackers, and that 30 damage added up very, very quickly. It was a phenomenal card that transformed the game and won Worlds more than once. But there were support cards here that helped. I mean, Dark Patch was pretty ridiculous. Dark Patch was an item card, and we've seen it printed with different names for different typing since. At the time, it was unique. And it was an item card that attached a basic Darkness Energy from your discard pile to a bench Darkness Pokemon. And there were decks that were built purely to get a turn 1 Night Spear, and yes, they could do it. So you would, and bearing in mind this was a point in the game when there were restrictions going first. You could play item cards, you could attack, you could do whatever you liked. So you would basically go first, and you would be hitting 90 damage and 30 to the bench before your opponent has even drawn a card. It was an absolutely dumb combination. And then we had Sableye. Now, Sableye, 70 HP, nothing special. 10 damage plus confusion, nothing special. But the attack Junk Hunt was absolutely special. For 1 energy, you put 2 item cards from your discard pile into your hand. And this did a couple of things. Firstly, it just gave rise to a whole run of disruption decks, where you would just recover cards like Crushing Hammer, and every turn you would play multiple Crushing Hammer. And you would just sit there junk hunting hammers and playing them until your opponent ran out of energy. And then you would attack with, I don't know, literally anything and win the game. But it was also a perfect partner for Darkrai. You would play a slightly slower deck, but you would keep junk hunting until you were nicely set up. And then you would come in and start smashing with Darkrai. Sableye was a phenomenal card in terms of a support for Darkrai, but it was also a phenomenal card in terms of a disruption deck in and of itself. Now, I mentioned Tornadus EX earlier. This was amazing, and it just fit into those Celebi Mewtwo decks, and it fit in there beautifully. You see, it had an attack for 2 energy, which did 30 damage, but if there was a stadium in play, you did 60 damage. For what it's worth, your stadium was going to be Sky Arrow Bridge. It gave all your support Pokemon, and for what it's worth, it actually did give Tornadus as well free retreat. And then for just a double colorless energy, and yes, you would obviously play double colorless energy here, you would do 60 damage. Bearing in mind, plus power was very prevalent at the time. You would play a bunch of these, and you could very easily get a turn 1 KO on all of these 60 and 70 HP support Pokemon, of which there were many. I won many a game with my CMT deck because I just focused in the early game around Tornadus EX, and I would basically just bench Tornadus and just use Blow Through over and over again. And I would not bench my little support Pokemon while I took out my opponents, and in the mirror match, that won me pretty much every mirror match game that mattered. which was wonderful. Oh yeah, also free energy, 100 damage. And bearing in mind, with Celebi attaching grass, you could very easily get a turn 1 100 with Tornadus. Blow-through was the better attack, but you could easily be hitting 100 damage with Tornadus here, which was pretty gosh darned awesome. It was phenomenal in these decks. Now, Raikou EX was also a pretty phenomenal card. It fit into those Eels decks, and it fit in there very, very nicely indeed. Remember that Electric let you attach lightning energy from the discard to your bench Pokemon, and this was one of the best attackers in those decks. Because for free energy, you discarded all the energy from Raikou and did 100 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. The thing is, discarding the energy didn't really matter because you were playing it with Eels. And you know how I keep saying over and over again about these little support Pokemon that really were played in every deck back then? Yeah, this would absolutely prey on them. Not to mention that this could hit the active, so it could get a KO on a Tornadus, which was honestly incredibly relevant, and you had an absolute powerhouse. This was the missing piece that really turned Electric into top tier decks. But not to be outdone, we had Entei EX as well. And at this stage, there might be some of you thinking, well, hang on a second. Raikou was really good, Entei was really good. I can't wait to hear how good Suicune was. Well, bet in, ladies and gentlemen, there's going to be a heck of a wait. There was never a Suicune EX, by which I mean Big E, Big X. Little E, Little X, back in the day there were actually two. In terms of Suicune EX in the Gen 5 era, yeah, they never made it. That card just never existed. I have no idea why, but we basically had two phenomenal beasts, as it were, but Suicune never got printed. Going back to Entei here, we had 2 energy, 30 damage plus burn, or free energy, 90 damage, and you get to attach a fire energy from your discard pile to one of your bench Pokemon. And what Entei really gave you was just consistent damage while accelerating energy. And that worked very nicely. So there's a bunch of EXs that were pretty gosh darn good. But how about Accelgor? Accelgor was a single prize Pokemon, and Accelgor was nuts. For 2 energy, but it was colorless, so double colorless energy would do fine. Deck and cover. 50 damage, plus paralysis, plus poison, and then you shuffled this Pokemon and all cards attached to it into your deck. So the theory when playing this was very simple. You wanted to get your deck as thin as absolute possible, preferably 0 cards in deck, so when you shuffled in there was just Shelmet, Accelgor, double colourless, and you'd every turn just draw your last 3 cards, attack, into the deck, and just cycle round. So your opponent spent the entire game paralysed and poisoned. Oh yeah, and you would play it with either Vileplume or Gothitelle, which would give you item lock. So your opponent was item locked and paralysed and poisoned. Yeah, Accelgor was pretty good. But you see, that gave us Espeon. Now, I've mentioned how Espeon was the Nationals promo, and I've mentioned how Espeon was in one of the theme decks, but it was actually just a really good card in its own right. Not for the attack was garbage. But the ability was awesome. Solar Revelation prevented all effects of your opponent's attacks other than damage done to each of your Pokemon with any energy attached to it. And basically this stopped Accelgor and Vanillux. There were other cards, but these were the 2 main reasons to play it. Because you see, Vanillux had a 15 in 16 chance of paralysis. And Accelgor had automatic paralysis. But when they didn't paralyze, they didn't do that much damage, and they were a bit rubbish. So if you had Espeon out and energy attached to your active, you completely shut those decks down. And as a bit of an example, when I grinded into Worlds, I didn't play Espeon. I chose not to. In Worlds proper, I played 2 Accelgor decks. I lost to them both, had the donk, went second, boo hits, etc. Had I played Espeon, I probably won, and I have a very good chance at doing well. And I know that because there was another person who grinded into Worlds in 2012 with CMT. It was Stefan Tobacco, and Stefan Tobacco did play Espeon in his CMT deck, and ended up making top 8 at Worlds that year. We both grinded in. I crashed out in Worlds. I went like 3-4 or something, and Stefan made top 8. And the only real difference in our lists, he played Espeon, and I didn't. Espeon was crazy good. Now, Empoleon will go down as one of my favourite cards ever released. It was one of those rare examples of a Pokemon with a great ability and a great attack. Diving Draw said that once during your turn you may discard a card from your hand and draw 2 cards, and then Attack Command did 10 damage for each Pokemon in play, yours and your opponent's. So if you got lucky, you could be doing 120 damage for a single energy. Plus you had a great draw engine, plus you were a single price Pokemon that only used 1 energy, so actually Mewtwo was horrendously inefficient trying to take you out. You pretty much always 2-hit KO EXs, because bearing in mind you'd have 6 Pokemon out, your opponent needed 3 for you to consistently 2-hit KO, and they struggled to have fewer than that. And it was just a really good, efficient card that saw play. I played a bunch of different Empoleon decks. It really was cool. Zoroark was not as good as it had been previously, but it deserves a mention. 2 energy, 20 damage for each Darkness Pokemon you have in play. You could use it with Dark Patch. It was a decent little tech in Darkrai decks, but if you look back at all the most successful Darkrai decks from the era, they actually didn't play Zoroark, so fun little card, didn't end up being good enough. Now, Kyogre wasn't exactly a powerhouse, but it fit very nicely into a few decks. Because you see, Dual Splash did 50 damage to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. So, against the Vileplume deck, they'd be playing Oddish that had, well, 40 HP. So, you know, that would take 2 of them down. And that's just one example. There were other decks around that used very small evolving Pokemon, and Kyogre was great at taking them out. It's almost playing Klinklang decks with Prism Energy, because you can move the energy over, attack with Kyogre, and then move it somewhere else after. It was very much a tech. It helped in an odd matchup here or there, but when it worked, it was a very good card. Similarly, Groudon EX was pretty good. 2 energy, 20 damage, plus 10 to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. And then 3 energy, 80 damage. But if the defending Pokemon already has 2 or more damage, that's where Trump comes in, you do 120 instead. It was a pretty good Darkrai counter. I played Darkrai Groudon at Nationals one year, because it beat other Darkrai decks. I ran about as cold as I've ever run in a tournament and crashed out doing terribly, while Jack Stewart Armstead played the deck and did very, very well indeed. I should mention I stole the idea from Jack, but yeah. That's one of those Nationals I really feel like I should have done better, but I didn't, so stop crying, Wassy. It was like a decade ago. Also, at Worlds that year, Jack played Groudon Darkrai, and he was playing against one of these setup decks that didn't put down an attacker. So Jack used Trump a couple times and then just drew past until time was called, used Trump, took a couple prizes, and won the game because his opponent was trying to set up support Pokemon like Vileplume and Chandelure and didn't actually have an attacker in play. So, yeah, that didn't go great for them, but it's a funny story about a weird game. And the last Pokemon that needs a quick shout out here is Heatmor. Heatmor was a very blatant Durant counter. It literally did extra damage to Durant and hit weakness on Durant. But the fact of the matter is that Durant actually was unplayable because Darkrai was so good at KOing it while also KOing the bench. So, unfortunately, Durant was gone and Heatmor never really worked. In terms of trainer cards, we got Ultra Ball, and Ultra Ball was crazy. Ultra Ball, you discard 2 cards from your hand and search for any Pokemon. We don't generally have cards like that. It is very rare to have a card which will just search for any Pokemon. Usually it's stuff like Level Ball that grabs any Pokemon with 90 HP or less. Yeah, you had to discard 2 cards from your hand, but being able to search any Pokemon really was a little bit nuts good. We had Dark Claw that let Darkness Pokemon do an extra 20 damage. It's a fun little fact that we would shortly after this end up with Muscle Band, which was exactly the same but worked on any Pokemon. But real Darkness players, they still use Dark Claw. It was fun. It was really fun. Enhanced Hammer was a kind of a weird card. It discarded a special energy from one of your opponent's Pokemon, but it came out at the same time as we had Lost Remover, which did the same thing, but it put the energy in the Lost Zone. So when this initially came out, the only reason to play it was because you were trying to be a bit clever. But when Lost Remover rotated, Enhanced Hammer became very good indeed. And then we had Random Receiver. It got you a random supporter. It would discard cards or reveal cards from the top of your deck until you found a supporter card. It was cool. It helped you get your supporters. It meant you could play things like 4 Professor Juniper and 4 Random Receiver, so you basically would only ever have Juniper, so you could have a faster, more consistent deck. It was really good for these kind of speed decks. Now, moving over into decks, this was a set that brought us a lot of decks, so we're going to go a little bit more quickly than we maybe usually would, because there really are a bunch to go through. Now, Darkrai really was the star of the set, and one of the decks that came around really quickly was Speed Darkrai. You had Dark Patch to accelerate energy, and bearing in mind you would also have Junk Arm, so Junk Arm could mean you essentially had more Dark Patch and more early Dark Patch and would get it rolling quicker. You would have the special Darkness energy, which would let you do a little bit of extra damage as well, just in case you weren't doing enough for some reason, which you probably would if I'm honest with you. And then you would really take advantage of Smeargle to get extra uses of supporter cards. And it was a very straightforward deck. The deck was really just built around, I am going to get a turn 1 Darkrai using these attacks that KO the active while hitting the bench before you've set up, and I'm going to run through you before you've got going. Bearing in mind we had Pokemon Catcher with Junk Arm at the time, so you would be able to take out any bench Pokemon you wanted basically every turn. If you wanted Gusting at the time, you had it. Tom Dolezal made top 8 of US Nats doing this. Sammy Sakoum made top 8 of Worlds going undefeated in Swiss. Shout out to PTCG Archive for that little nugget of information. I'd forgotten that. Also, while we're here, shout out to Bulbapedia for helping me out with some of the facts of this set. Very good website, great for research. So yeah, that was a deck. But we also had Darkrai Sableye. Now, Darkrai Sableye was a bit of a slower version of the deck, where you would use Junk Hunt a lot more. Now, this is a deck with which Jason Klaczynski won the World Championships in 2013, and this was a deck that really liked Enhanced Hammer. Because what you would essentially do is you would just Junk Hunt for it every single turn. So you would always have Enhanced Hammer. We also had Hypnotoxic Laser, which would poison and on a coin flip put them to sleep. It was a bit early for that. We didn't have Laser at the time, but Hypnotoxic Laser would come along a little bit later. And this was a very cool deck, which, was pretty good. But in 2012, at Worlds, the one Worlds I was lucky enough to be able to actually have the money to attend, it was all about Darkrai Mewtwo. Like, Darkrai Mewtwo was basically the top cut, other than Stefan Tobacco with his CMT deck. And obviously, Worlds was won by Darkrai Mewtwo, that was a given. The finals was a Darkrai Mewtwo mirror match. And the theory was really simple. Darkrai and Mewtwo are the best cards in the game, let's just make a deck with those two. So people did. They played Shaman. Remember that Shaman moved all your energy, so you could move it over to Mewtwo to sweep for the game. You would use Terrakion as a counter to your opponent's Darkrai, bearing in mind you would have Mewtwo to counter your opponent's Mewtwo. And then you would have Eviolite as well. That was a pretty good card in the deck, because it reduced damage done to basic Pokemon, and you were very much a basic Pokemon deck. So that seemed to make quite a bit of sense. It wasn't just a good deck, this was an oppressive deck, and if you're talking about the most dominant decks ever, Darkrai Mewtwo in 2012 absolutely makes the list. Now, as a deck I've kind of mentioned in previous weeks, but Accelgor Vileplume Chandelure was a nightmare to play against. The theory was very simple. Vileplume item locked, Accelgor paralyzed and poisoned, and then when you went into the deck, we would use Chandelure in the active to place free damage counters as you like. And the deck would often actually play Darkrai to give Chandelure free retreat. So essentially what you would do is paralyze and poison with Accelgor, pop Chandelure up, drop some damage counters, retreat, Accelgor, and round we go while your opponent is item locked. At Worlds in 2012, I told you I lost 2 Accelgor decks in 2 rounds. Well, one of them was played by Pablo Meza, and in one of the most impressive losses I've ever suffered, he took 6 prizes in 1 turn. Remember, at the time, N was everywhere, so he was clearly playing to try and make sure I couldn't take advantage of N. And I couldn't. And I didn't like losing. Again, I had the donk in hand, went second, and that was the end of the game. But I tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, seeing your opponent take 6 prizes in 1 turn, that's pretty impressive. Like, as far as wins go, that is pretty gosh darned impressive. Was I happy about it? Honestly, kind of a little bit. It was a really good play from my opponent. But we also had Accelgor with Gothitelle. Very similar theory, of course. You paralyze and poison with Accelgor, put Gothitelle active, your opponent is item locked. The big difference here is that you are not item locked, just your opponent, whereas Vileplume gets you both. Really, we needed Boundaries Crossed and Dust Noir for this deck, because it let you move 1 damage counter from your opponent's Pokemon to another one. So what you would actually do here is you would lock something in the active, using Pokemon Catcher again. You weren't item locked. And then you would never KO the active, you would continually use Dust Noir to move damage from the active to the bench. So you would just never take a KO until you won the game. It was kind of nuts. Also on PTCGO, it took like 4 clicks to move 1 damage counter with Dust Noir. Playing with and against this deck on PTCGO was a bit of a nightmare. Now, Klinklang was actually the deck in 2012 that won US National Championships. And this was that Klinklang that moved energy around. And you used Prism Energy here, so you could pay basically any attack cost. And the theory was very simple. You use Klinklang to move Prism Energy around to get the best attacker for the particular matchup. And you would have Max Potion here, so that if you didn't get 1-hit KO'd, and at the time it was not a 1-hit KO format, your opponent would hit you, you would move the energy off the Pokemon, Max Potion, there's no energy to discard, move it back and go. It was played with Darkrai, because Darkrai was still one of the best attackers in the game, and it meant that you could always move a Prism Energy to your active, free retreat and go. Groudon as a counter to Darkrai. Kyogre for taking out those evolving Pokemon, those little Pokemon. Shaymin EX, really good both as a grass-type attacker and a revenge attacker. Once you've given up a few prizes, like I said before, Shaymin EX became awesome. And the Cobalion that was able to stop your opponent attacking the following turn, which seemed pretty gosh darned good. The thing was, this deck was actually hyper vulnerable to Lost Remover. But nobody played Lost Remover at the US Nationals. John Roberts did play the same deck at Worlds and went something like 4-3. He did fine, but everyone was playing Lost Remover by that point. And unfortunately, that kind of hurt the deck. Now, I mentioned Quad Entei earlier. Curtis Leon did win Canadian Nationals with the deck. And it was just using Entei to do decent damage while accelerating energy. The deck did play Mewtwo to counter Mewtwo and Terrakion to counter Darkrai, like so many decks at the time. But this was just a really nice, efficient deck. And finally, one of my favourite decks, Empoleon Terrakion. 2 of my favourite Pokemon, 2 of my favourite cards ever. And basically, Empoleon was really good. And Terrakion was a great revenge attacker. So Empoleon was my draw engine, and I'd use Empoleon a lot of the time. But against Darkrai, or any time my opponent took a KO and I could take advantage of it, Terrakion would come in to retaliate. I loved that deck. Top cut a bunch of little tournaments with it. Lots of fond memories. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen, a slightly longer look at the set, but unfortunately there were so many good cards and so many good decks, this really was a set with a lot to say about it. But now it's the usual deal, it's over to you guys. Tell me your memories of the set if you were playing at the time. Tell me your thoughts having seen it now if you weren't. Go nuts in the comment section, but be nice! And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at TheWasi, and Twitch for some live action at twitch.tv/PTCGRadio. If you want to support the channel, get some bonus podcasts and all that good stuff, head on over to patreon.com/PTCGRadio, where you can do exactly that. But by far the most important thing is always, look after yourselves till next time, would ya? Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.